Okay, so you want to own a flight school. Picture the tarmac at 6 in the morning, propeller wash rippling through the grass, a line of Cessnas waiting like patient horses, and a 19-year-old in a headset climbing into the left seat for the first time. Picture the framed photos of graduates wearing epaulets they haven't earned yet, jet fuel and gas station coffee mixing in the cold air. That is the fantasy. It sells youth, altitude, and a version of yourself signing checks instead of writing them. Now picture a locked hangar door on a Thursday in August, a handwritten sign taped to the glass, and two former students outside holding printouts of deposits that no longer exist. That happened. Manassas, Virginia, August 1, 2024. Here is the number that should stop the fantasy before it forms. A brand new Cessna 172, the industry's default trainer, costs somewhere between $500,000 and $520,000 flyaway, and you'll rent it out to a nervous 18-year-old for about $180 an hour. Not $1,800, not $18,000, $180. Here's the real question. Why does the person who owns the runway usually get rich, while the person who owns the airplane just survives? The answer has almost nothing to do with the airplane itself, which we will get to later, because that's where a huge amount of the real money hides. A flight school is not one business, it's three, wearing the same uniform. The first door is the small Part 61 operation, 2 or 3 airplanes, one owner-instructor, flexible scheduling, the kind of shop that trains weekend hobbyists and the occasional career changer out of a single hangar. Part 61 is the FAA's looser, instructor-directed training track, where the syllabus lives mostly in the instructor's head and experience rather than in a filed document. Startup costs here run somewhere between $150,000 and $300,000, and the business survives on relationships more than systems. The second door is the Part 141 Academy, 5 to 8 aircraft, an FAA-approved training course outline, or TCO, the structured, government-sanctioned syllabus a school must file and follow maneuver by maneuver, plus scheduled stage checks, periodic in-house proficiency tests a student must pass before advancing to the next phase. This tier runs somewhere between $400,000 and $750,000 to open, according to Aviatize, and it exists to process career pilots at volume, feeding an airline industry that is permanently hungry for hours builders. The third door is the Academy-scale operation, $1 million and up, multiple locations, simulator bays, contracts with universities and sometimes with regional airlines directly. That second door, the Part 141 Academy, is the one worth walking through, because that's where the real numbers and the real trap show up most clearly. Keep that $180 an hour figure in your head. You'll need it. And notice something else. Nobody in any of these 3 doors has told you yet who actually owns the airplanes parked on the ramp. Hold on to that question too. It matters more than it sounds like right now. The price of admission arrives in layers, and each layer is bigger than the one before it. First, the aircraft. A brand new Cessna 172 runs $500,000 to $520,000 flyaway in 2026. Buy used instead, and the number drops. A 2009 to 2020 model runs somewhere between $320,000 and $450,000. And anything from the 1997 to 2008 era runs $230,000 to $350,000. Multiply that by the 5 or 6 airplanes a Part 141 Academy needs to actually function, and the fleet alone costs more than most people spend on a house, sometimes more than most people spend on 3 houses. Second, certification. Part 141 status is not automatic. It requires building and filing that training course outline with the FAA, documenting every maneuver, every stage check, every logged hour, and submitting to inspections a Part 61 shop never has to see. According to Aviatize, this compliance process alone can take months and typically requires hiring staff whose entire job is paperwork, not flying. Third, insurance, and here's where the fantasy starts to itch. A commercial flight school policy on a single aircraft runs somewhere between $8,000 and $15,000 a year, compared with $1,200 to $5,000 for the identical airplane under a private owner's policy. That gap exists because an aircraft rented out to dozens of different students, many flying it for the first time, is statistically a different animal entirely. Multiply that premium across a fleet of 6, and insurance alone becomes a six-figure annual bill before a single student pays for a single hour of flight time. Fourth, hangar space. Rent runs somewhere between $150 and $300 a month for a modest facility inland, and $500 to $1,000 plus a month in a major metro market, where the land underneath the runway is worth more than the runway itself. Fifth, staffing the place before it opens. 3 entry-level instructors, hired ahead of the first paying student, run somewhere between $35,000 and $55,000 a year apiece in salary alone, a payroll obligation that starts on day 1, long before the wet rate starts covering it. Added up, aircraft, certification, insurance, hangar, and instructor payroll, and a mid-sized Part 141 academy opens its doors in the same $400,000 to $750,000 hole Aviatize describes for the category. And that figure doesn't include a single gallon of fuel. Here's the trap. The sticker price gets you in the door. What keeps eating you is everything that never made it onto the brochure. Start with fuel, the asset that quietly bleeds money every single hour an engine runs. Avgas, the leaded, 100-octane fuel every piston trainer burns, average 6.42 cents a gallon self-serve and 7.47 full-serve in June 2026, according to General Aviation News. That full-service price climbed 17.3% in just 6 months, from 6.37 cents in January to 7.47 in June. A Cessna 172 burns somewhere between 8.5 and 10 gallons an hour, which means every single training flight quietly drains $54 to $75 in fuel before the instructor, the insurance, or the hangar rent gets a dime. Then there's the engine, the single most patient predator in the entire business. Piston engines need a full overhaul on a fixed schedule, no matter how gently they're flown, and that overhaul costs somewhere between $26,000 and $40,000 at an independent shop, or $45,000 to $55,000 plus for a factory remanufactured unit. Smart operators set aside somewhere between $15 and $25 for every flight hour just to pre-fund that eventual day, which means the engine is quietly billing the business years before it actually fails. Annual inspections add another somewhere between $1,000 to $2,000 in labor per aircraft, plus $1,000 to $4,000 in parts, every year on every tail number, whether that airplane flew 500 hours or 50. None of it is optional. None of it can be deferred past the FAA's clock. And then there's the asset that never stops complaining, the instructor corps. Entry-level CFIs, certified flight instructors, the FAA credential legally required to teach a student, earn somewhere between $25 and $40 an hour, or roughly $35,000 to $55,000 a year, according to the backseat pilot. But here's where it gets dangerous for the business model. Almost every CFI treats the job as a stepping stone, logging dual given, the hours an instructor spends actively teaching, which is the exact metric their pay and their future airline resume both run on, until they've built enough hours to leave for a regional airline. You are not hiring career employees. You are running a farm system for an industry that never pays you a transfer fee. So how does the money actually come in? The first and most obvious layer is the wet rate, the hourly rental price for an aircraft that includes fuel, quoted at somewhere around $180 an hour for a Cessna 172, according to Aviatize. Picture a single airplane flying 60 hours in a busy month. That's roughly $10,800 in monthly revenue from one tail number, before a single expense gets subtracted. The second layer is instruction itself. The CFI's hourly rate gets marked up and billed alongside the aircraft rental, so every hour of dual given generates 2 separate invoice lines instead of 1. The airplane charges you, and so does the person sitting next to you, and neither charge is optional if you actually want to learn to fly it. The third layer is the check ride ecosystem, a designated pilot examiner, or DPE, a private individual authorized by the FAA to administer the practical test, not a government employee, charges somewhere between $500 and $800 for the exam alone, and the full check ride, once you add aircraft rental and incidentals, runs $750, $1,400 total, according to Pilot Institute. The school doesn't necessarily keep every dollar of that, but almost none of it moves without touching the business first. Multiply that by dozens of students finishing their certificates every year, and the check ride fee becomes a small, steady tax the business collects simply by existing near the finish line. None of this happens against a backdrop of guaranteed, ever-growing demand either. According to aviation writer Jason Blair's analysis of FAA data, the number of new student pilot certificates issued nationally fell 12% year-over-year in 2024, the first decline since 2016. The waiting list looks great right up until the pipeline feeding it starts to shrink. Here's where it gets interesting. Stack the wet rate, the instruction markup, and the check ride fees across a fleet of 6 aircraft running near full capacity, and the top-line revenue of a mid-sized Part 141 academy looks genuinely impressive on a spreadsheet, climbing plausibly into 7 figures a year once every student, every stage check, and every logged hour is counted. So far, a flight school sounds like a machine that quietly prints money out of propeller wash and jet fuel. 6 airplanes, a full schedule, a waiting list of 18-year-olds who watched one recruiting video and decided this was their calling. Now, here's the other side of the ledger. Run the real math, and that impressive top line collapses fast. Fuel, insurance, engine reserves, hangar rent, and CFI payroll eat nearly everything the wet rate brings in, and according to people who've actually operated these businesses, a flight school's true operating margin is famously thin, often described as single-digit, even in years when demand is strong. A savings account pays more, and a savings account doesn't require insuring a $500,000 airplane against a 19-year-old's first solo landing. Here's the part nobody tells you before you sign the loan. The smartest operators in this business don't actually own most of their airplanes. Remember the question from a few minutes ago about who really owns the aircraft on the ramp? Here's the answer. A lot of the time, it isn't the school at all. It's called a leaseback, an arrangement where a private individual who already owns a Cessna 172 places it with the school to be rented out to students, splitting the revenue instead of the school carrying the full $500,000 asset on its own balance sheet. According to AOPA, the mechanism survives because the tax incentives line up neatly on both sides at once. The aircraft owner deducts depreciation and loan interest as a private investor, while the school deducts the entire rental payment as a simple, current-year operating expense. Neither side owns the whole risk. Both sides own a piece of the write-off. It also means the school can add a 7th or 8th airplane to its schedule without ever touching its own cash reserves. Growth without the capital that growth would normally require. That's layer 1 of the reveal. The fleet parked on the ramp may not even belong to the business whose name is painted on the hangar door. But even the leaseback isn't the deepest room in this building. It only explains how the training business survives its own thin margins. It doesn't explain how anyone actually gets rich doing this. For that, stop looking at the airplanes entirely and start looking at the pavement underneath them. We'll come back to that, because that's where the real fortune sits, and it has almost nothing to do with teaching anyone to fly. Consider Galvin Flying. It opened at Boeing Field, King County International Airport, designated KBFI, in 1930, back when commercial aviation itself was still a novelty act. Over 94 years, it trained more than 20,000 pilots, becoming such a permanent fixture of Seattle's aviation community that generations of local pilots simply assumed it would always be there, the way you assume a familiar bridge will hold your weight. Students who soloed there in the 1970s brought their own kids back decades later to start the same training, in the same pattern, over the same runway. Then, in late November 2024, it closed. Not gradually, abruptly. According to reporting from the Seattle Times, Flying Mag, and AOPA, roughly 40 employees were let go without severance. Mid-career instructors and mechanics who had built their working lives around a company that had outlasted the Great Depression, 3 wars, and the entire dawn of the jet age, only to run out of runway in a single autumn week. Galvin had been the last fixed-wing flight school still operating at KBFI. When it closed, an entire category of aviation training vanished from one of the busiest general aviation airports in the country, seemingly overnight. No ceremony, no wind-down sail, just a notice on a door that generations of pilots had walked through without ever imagining it could close. Read that again. 94 years surviving fuel shocks, insurance cycles, and engine overhauls back to back to back, and it still ended with a handwritten sign taped to a locked glass door and no severance checks for the people who kept it running. The lesson isn't that Galvin was poorly managed. 94 years says otherwise. The lesson is that in this business, thin margins never actually disappear. They just get deferred, year after year, until one cost cycle, an insurance renewal, a fuel spike, a lease that doesn't get renewed, arrives at the exact moment the reserves aren't deep enough to absorb it. A business can be beloved, historic, and fully booked, and still be exactly one bad year away from a handwritten sign on the glass. So why does the runway make people rich while the runway's tenant just survives? Stop looking at the flight school and look instead at the company that actually controls the airport-side infrastructure, the fuel farms, the hangar space, the ramp access, the de-icing trucks. That company is called an FBO, a fixed base operator, and it is the landlord every flight school, every private owner, and every corporate jet has to pay just to exist on the property. Airports rarely grant more than one or two of these leases per field, often for decades at a time, which means an FBO isn't really competing for customers so much as it's collecting rent from an entire industry that has nowhere else to land. In May 2021, Signature Aviation, the largest FBO network on Earth with more than 200 locations, sold for $4.7 billion to a consortium including Blackstone, Global Infrastructure Partners, and Cascade. Read that again, $4.7 billion, for a company that mostly just pumps fuel and rents hangar space. Now scale that. Atlantic Aviation, the country's second-largest FBO network, was valued at roughly $5 billion when KKR held it back in 2021. By March 30, 2026, when Apollo and GIC bought in, that valuation had nearly doubled to roughly $10 billion, an implied 13 to 14 times EBITDA on sector-wide operating margins somewhere between 35 and 45%. Compare that to the flight school's famously thin, often single-digit margins, and the picture becomes obvious. The airplanes are the bait. The fuel pump and the airport lease are the business. Private jet departures grew roughly 25% between 2020 and 2023, and every one of those departures needs fuel, a ramp, and a hangar, sold by an FBO at FBO margins, regardless of who happens to own the flight school parked next door. The flight school teaches people to fly. The FBO gets paid every single time anyone, anywhere, actually does. Picture that same mid-sized Part 141 Academy running 6 Cessna 172s, the representative school you've been following from the start. In a great year, all 6 aircraft fly somewhere near 60 hours a month at that $180 wet rate. Fuel prices sit closer to January's number than June's spike. No engine hits its overhaul limit, and insurance renews flat. Revenue lands somewhere north of $750,000 for the year. Fuel runs a manageable few $100s a day across the fleet, payroll stays level, and after fuel, insurance, hangar rent, CFI payroll, and engine reserves, the school nets somewhere between $60,000 and $90,000. Thin, but real, and enough to keep the lights on and the waiting list growing. In a rough year, avgas jumps another 17% the way it did between January and June of 2026. One aircraft hits its engine overhaul at the high end, near $50,000. Insurance renews 20% higher after a single minor incident, and utilization drops because 2 experienced CFIs leave for airline jobs mid-season, while their replacements spend months just ramping up. Fuel alone can add tens of thousands of dollars to the year. The overhaul takes one aircraft out of service for weeks. That same 6-airplane school, same address, same fleet, same wet rate, can post a net loss somewhere between $80,000 and $120,000. Rough year, great year. The swing between them is easily over $500,000 in a business that never changed what it charged, never changed its airplanes, and never changed its address. Remember the wet rate? It's the same $180 an hour in both scenarios. The difference was never what you charge. It's what breaks and when. Picture that ramp again. 6 in the morning, propeller wash rippling through the grass, a 19-year-old in a headset climbing into the left seat for the first time. That image never lied to you. It's real, And it happens every single day at flight schools across the country. What it never told you is who actually gets rich from it. Not the person renting out the Cessna, the person who owns the fuel pump, the hangar, and the ground lease underneath the entire operation. The airplane was never really the product. The airport was.